Welcome to Asia Pacific Defense Reporter, your go-to source for cutting-edge security insights in the region. Get ready for rapid-fire analysis and commentary from the Asia Pacific with your host, Kim Bergman.
Hello and welcome back. Events in the Middle East have a tendency at the moment to move rather quickly, so rather than spending time making too many predictions that could be dated by the time you hear this, I'll just start with a quick summary. Remember, this is Monday when I'm recording this. Peace talks between the US and Iran in Pakistan have failed. It sounds like the US demanded 100% agreement to everything, which doesn't really sound like a negotiation to me. It sounds like Donald Trump was insisting on a complete take-it-or-leave-it approach to the deal. And I should point out that during these negotiations, both President Donald Trump and Secretary of State Marco Rubio were at a UFC cage fighting match, which I think tells you a lot about the state of US politics. Rather than talking about all of this in the abstract, I'm going to try and relate it to Australia's national security interests, which no one seems to be doing. The latest is the US has announced its own blockade of the Hormuz Strait, trying to open up the Straits of Hormuz by blockading it. So that means the previous trickle of tankers selling Iranian oil to China will be reduced to zero, so expect further upward pressure on energy prices. And speaking of which, and before I get into the substance of this podcast, is it only me who has noticed that both the Prime Minister and Defence Minister are burning up huge amounts of jet fuel on international travel during a fuel crisis? The Prime Minister was in Singapore last week, flew back to Australia for the weekend, and by the time you're hearing this podcast, he will be on his way back to Malaysia, which is next door to Singapore. This is totally ridiculous and cements the Prime Minister's reputation of gouging taxpayers for as much as possible. What on earth was wrong with the idea of spending the weekend in Singapore or Kuala Lumpur or even Brunei? I mean, they're all nice places. The Prime Ministerial aircraft, the 737 VIP, it averages 2,200 litres of fuel per hour. Avgas is around $2.50 a litre, so that's burning through, literally, $5,000 per hour. It's an 8 or 9 hour flight to Singapore, so you can do the maths. Now, even worse than that, I thought, was the trip that Richard Marles made to Japan, because my Japanese sources tell me they didn't have any real idea of why he was coming, and they only found out about it at quite short notice, and it looks like he was there for a few hours of talks that could have been done via Zoom. Now, I'll have a bit more to say about this in a moment, because the antics of both the Prime Minister and Defence Minister are a huge slap in the face for another close ally, namely South Korea. Just mark this spot. Anyway, I'm glad I had a 1 week break for Easter because, as I say, events in the Middle East are moving quickly and in unpredictable directions. And if I had recorded a podcast last Monday, it would have been in the immediate wake of Donald Trump's appalling comments about wiping out Iran and its civilization completely. Now, those comments, which appear, by the way, to have led to our Prime Minister growing a hint of a spine and pushing back, but the threat has not been withdrawn, and Trump keeps on referring to the resumption of bombing and the continuing destruction of Iran. Now, also during the Easter break, I explained to my cat, Brian, some people know that I have a cat, I explained to him how the washing machine works. I was doing some washing. He came and sat next to me. He was very interested in what was going on and appeared to be paying close attention as I described the various settings on the machine. Now, he's a very vocal cat, and when I asked him if he understood, he meowed loudly. Now, do I think my cat actually understood a single word? Well, no, obviously not. He's a cat. He doesn't understand English, with the partial exception of his name and possibly the word biscuit. Now, where am I going with this? I mention this because this week the next National Defence Strategy is going to be released, and I will be very pleasantly surprised if it's not dead on arrival, because it would have been drafted months ago by people who simply cannot comprehend that the world is changing around them. This is trying to explain to national security people that the United States is no longer a reliable ally. Something that we can all see with our own eyes is as frustrating as trying to explain to a cat how a washing machine works. You can see the erratic behaviour of the United States. I mean, that's no longer surely in doubt. But I think that it could be permanent. You see, people sort of try and convince themselves, well, it's just an aberration. It's just, Trump will go and then things will return to what we used to consider normal. There's a chance that that might happen, but I, in fact, think that the damage is permanent. And as I've said before, and speaking very frankly, the good citizens of the United States can no longer be relied upon not to do this again. 77 million Americans voted for Trump 2.0 in 2024, an increase of 3 million from his first-term presidency. Now, as I probably mentioned, the entire Australian defence, foreign policy, national security debate is controlled by a relatively small number of people, namely probably the 10 most senior officials in the Departments of Defence, Prime Minister and Cabinet, Foreign Affairs and Trade, and you can throw in a few people from a few agencies, such as the Office of National Assessment and the Australian Signals Directorate. Ministers typically have neither the experience, the intellect, or the energy needed to push back against this group. And with a bit of polite window dressing, ministers being convinced that they're the ones who have come up with these ideas, they end up doing fairly much as they are told. So what does this mean for Australia's national security? Well, I don't know in detail. I don't have a crystal ball. We'll find out. But I can't think of a good interpretation. All that I can see is a world of increasing chaos and lack of reliability of the United States. Previously, everyone assumed that if Australia was attacked, the United States would deploy forces to Australia to protect us. Can we assume that that is still the case? I would argue absolutely not. You would hope it would happen, but as I and a number of others have been saying, hope is not a substitute for effective policy. Now, I mentioned that the Prime Minister has finally pushed back when Trump threatened to destroy Iran's civilization, which was a possible reference to the use of nuclear weapons, I suppose. The Prime Minister finally managed to label the comments as extraordinary, meaning that in a negative way. Now, I would have preferred a stronger form of words, such as, for example, totally unacceptable from the leader of any nation, let alone the world's largest military power. Now, the results have come in from the Hungarian election. There's a change of government. The horrible Viktor Orban has gone after 16 years. And remember, US Vice President J.D. Vance flew to Hungary last week to campaign actively on behalf of Orban and to make it clear that he, Orban, had the full support of Donald Trump. This is obviously an outrageous act of US interference on behalf of the far right in the Hungarian domestic elections. And let's see how people in Australia feel about that when J.D. Vance arrives here and starts campaigning on behalf of Pauline Hanson or the One Nation Party. Now, by the way, that's not a party political comment. I would be equally outraged if the US Vice President arrived here to campaign for Labor or the coalition. But this is the stuff that is becoming increasingly frequent on the part of the Trump administration. And speaking of outrages, the Defense Secretary, or as he likes to call himself, the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, his statements about bombing Iran as part of a holy war, I think is really shocking stuff. And he argues that America is being guided in all of this by Jesus. He carries on like a 6-year-old who has had far too much red cordial and who has just watched a few episodes of Power Rangers. He is a national embarrassment who should be removed. But in Trump's administration, he will survive until Trump needs a scapegoat. And I won't torture people with extensive quotes, but here's a single one from many that gives you a flavour of his rantings. He recently said in public, this is the direct quote, "Blessed be the Lord my rock, who trains my hands for war and my fingers for battle." Well, clearly this man is a religious nutcase. Oh, whoops, sorry, that's very judgmental of me. He is a religious fanatic, a zealot who belongs to an extreme Christian movement that preaches superiority over other religions, and incidentally believes that women should know their place, in the kitchen and popping out little religious fanatics of the future. Some people might think what happens in the US is their business, but this fueling of religious hatred has potential consequences for Australia. More seriously, it has potential consequences for our large neighbour Indonesia, which happens to be the world's most populous Islamic nation. Indonesia has a troubled history of religious violence, and a particularly nasty episode happened between 1999 and 2003 in Ambon. I've been to Ambon, and it's now a peaceful place, though with a noticeable military presence. But in the conflict between 3,000 and 5,000 Christians and Muslims killed each other. The last thing Indonesia needs is a fruitcake like Hegseth mouthing off this religious nonsense. He's covered, incidentally, with crusader tattoos, because if some fellow travellers in Ambon, or anyone else, believe this crap, they might be tempted to follow suit. And speaking of Indonesia, last week I noticed the visit of a Russian naval flotilla. You heard that right. Ships from the Russian Pacific Fleet arrived in a place just to Australia's north. And let's not forget last year's rumours that Russia had requested the permanent basing of some of their military aircraft on Biak Island, which is 1,200 kilometres from Darwin, well within the range of a Tu-95 Bear H. The missile-carrying version of that aircraft can fly unrefuelled for 15,000 kilometres, meaning it could actually easily reach Sydney. And the same is true for a nuclear-capable T-162 Blackjack, which has a range of 12,000 kilometres. At the time, Indonesia denied absolutely that this was something that was under consideration, but I'm still not entirely sure, because it's part of a pattern. That these events need to be seen in the overall context of deployments and not just treated as one-off isolated events. The current flotilla is a multi-role corvette, plus a submarine, plus a supply ship. But just as recently, in 2024, the joint exercises between Russia and Indonesia involved 3 Russian corvettes, a submarine, and a supply ship. And why aren't Australian planners more concerned? As I've said before, weakening Russia is so obviously in Australia's strategic interests. What is the very best way of weakening Russia? And Russia, of course, has the full-on support of Donald Trump. The best way to weaken Russia is to increase dramatically our level of support for Ukraine. Ukraine is doing the heavy lifting on behalf of Australia, but the triumvirate of Albo, Wong and Miles simply do not care. Now, I'm going to circle back to the trip that Richard Marles made to Japan, ostensibly to talk energy security, amongst other things. And as I mentioned, the Japanese really had no idea of why he was coming. As it happened, I think he actually got the country wrong. It's South Korea, not Japan, that is the biggest exporter of fuel to Australia. That's something that the Prime Minister needs to understand as well. I'll repeat, South Korea, along with Singapore, is the biggest exporter of petroleum and petroleum products to Australia. Not Japan, not Brunei, not Malaysia, South Korea. Now, Richard Marles then added insult to injury by referring to Japan as Australia's most important regional partner. This is another gratuitous slap in the face of the Koreans because, as everyone, particularly government ministers, should be aware, there is historical rivalry between Japan and South Korea, and putting one ahead of the other generates offence in the mind of the country that has been downgraded or which has missed out. It's something where Australia is remarkably tin-eared, and all of our politicians need to follow the sort of format that US diplomats use, using phrases like Australia has no more important a partner than insert the name of a country. Because what you're doing with that form of words, it keeps everyone happy. You're paying a compliment to the country that you're visiting, but you're not stepping on the toes of the country that has missed out. The Koreans in Seoul, they must be wondering what on earth is going on. They have tried repeatedly to make it clear that they are interested in working with Australia. They are in a better position than Japan to transfer a lot of military technology to us. They have put forward a number of areas where we could work co-developing systems. All of this has been ignored by the politicians and these very self-same national security bureaucrats who have crafted the next National Defence Strategy document. Now, as usual, I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to quickly canter through a few points that caught my eye in the past week. When we talk about the Straits of Hormuz, the ability of Iran to close that waterway, there has been no discussion that I've seen about Iran's mini submarines. They have about 20 of them. Being a mini sub, they're small, 700 tons, small crew, but they carry 2 heavyweight torpedoes. And even if a few of them have survived, they could do catastrophic damage with attacks on tanker traffic and indeed USN warships. They are the prime example of asymmetric warfare. Nuclear-powered submarines in that context are useless. It is the miniature submarines that will dominate. And while most of the reporting has been about US behavior, how about Israel? Attacking Iran, invading southern Lebanon, and they're having a tough time there, while also simultaneously bombing Syria. You know, I think it's possibly time that our politicians had something to say about that as well. The Redback infantry fighting vehicle, there was an ANAO report that was critical of the project. It wasn't criticism of the Redback, it was criticism of the methodology followed by defence. I might elaborate on that in the future. And another announcement, there's been a test firing of a GMLRS round at Port Wakefield, which has been trumpeted as a masterpiece of Australian missile development. No, the weapon was assembled in Australia, but of components 100% of US origin. Doesn't really look like an Australian development to me. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye for now, and see you next time.
That's today's Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. For more in-depth articles, expert opinions and exclusive interviews, visit AsiaPacificDefenceReporter.com. Stay informed, stay ahead. This is your source for all things defence. Until next time.